Hello, everyone. We're now going to come to a somewhat more difficult topic, or something that is not often addressed so thoroughly in introductory courses on phonology, precisely because it requires some treatment of syntactic structure, and that becomes a little more difficult in reference to just morphological structure. In the examples we've seen so far today, we've seen rules that either are sensitive in some way to the internal morphological constituency of words, or processes that simply ignore any morphological or syntactic constituency whatsoever, like the British English process of R epenthesis. In terms of creating so-called phonological phrases, phrase boundaries, the reason things become more complex is because we need to refer to syntactic structure. So we refer back to the different types of boundaries that we introduced here. At the beginning of the lecture, we're looking at this zone, the phrase zone, some group of multiple words where there could be some boundary unit delimiting, that is separating one group of words from another group of words. And our assumption is going to be that phrase boundaries are created by syntactic boundaries. And here we're following the theory, essentially, that syntactic phrases are directly mapped onto phonological phrases. So where there is a syntactic boundary, that will be translated into a phonological boundary. So when we see in a syntactic tree a full phrase boundary, the words that are dominated by that full phrase boundary will be contained within the same phonological phrase. So now we're going to be looking at a few we're going to be looking at an example from the language Chimwini, which is drawn from the textbook that clearly illustrates these sorts of boundaries. Okay, so here we'll need a set of 4 different rules. Before I introduce the rules, let's have a look at the phrases here. So within this tree, we have 3 phrase boundaries. So we have, within this sentence, there's a noun phrase, 2 noun phrases, the words warabu, an Arab, chirembe, a turban, and vete, the verb put on. So within this verb phrase, we have 2 words belonging to the same phrase. So we can see that these words would be within one phonological phrase, which excludes this noun phrase, warabu. And that is going to be the important point for us. So let's briefly describe the set of rules that are relevant here and the boundaries that they refer to. So there's a rule which lengthens a vowel at the right edge of a word final lengthening, a word which we will call pre-antepenultimate shortening, which shortens a vowel inside one phonological phrase if that vowel is followed by 3 further vowels. Then a process which shortens a vowel at the edge of a phrase. And finally, a process which shortens a vowel if the immediately following vowel is long. So 4 rules which all have to do with the lengthening or shortening of segments, 1 rule which lengthens segments, and 3 others which can shorten segments. So given this utterance, what we'll see is that wherever we have whatever corresponds to the right edge of a phrase, syntactically will become a phrase phonologically. So this means we're going to have 2 phonological phrases, one at the sentence level. So in effect, we're basically saying that whatever full XP nodes, whatever syntactic phrase nodes, which are dominated by the full sentence node, the whole utterance node, those will give us our phonological phrases. So our 2 phonological phrases then will be warabu and vete chirembe. Now, the rules have this crucial ordering. I think I put them in the order in which they actually apply, yes. So here are the underlying representations. So in the underlying representations, the first word has an underlying, each of these words has a short vowel underlyingly as the last vowel, and the first vowel of the word warabu has an underlying long vowel. The first vowel of the verb vete has an underlying long vowel, and the second vowel of the word turban, chirembe, has a long A. So first, word final lengthening applies and looks for the right edge of a word. So similar to word final devoicing in German or Russian. So through this rule, the U, the A, and the other A at the end of each word become long, and we generate the forms warabu, vete, and chirembe. Then we have this process of pre-antepenultimate shortening, which looks for a long vowel followed by 3 further vowels inside the same phrase. In this case, 3 or more further vowels within the same phrase. So in this case, there are within this phrase, the phonological phrase resulting from the verb phrase node here, both of the 2 long A vowels are going to be able, in the verb vete, following the application of word final lengthening, are going to be able to undergo this process. So there are 3 vowels in the following word, chirembe. So the first A is shortened, and then there are 3 vowels following this A as well inside the same phrase. But on the other hand, inside this phonological phrase, just consisting of this noun phrase, neither of the long vowels here are followed by 3 further vowels. So u, the long u, is at the end of the phrase, so it remains long for the moment, and then the long a, remains long because there are only 2 further vowels, a and u, within the same phrase. The next process, the phrase final shortening, then has the effect of shortening the vowels that were made long by word final lengthening in the first word and last word of the sentence. The long u here is at the end of a phrase and so becomes a short u. The long a here at the end of chirembe becomes short. And finally, the last process of pre-long shortening no longer has a target. If phrase final shortening had applied after pre-long shortening, then things would behave differently. We can see actually that there is a that phrase final shortening here bleeds pre-long shortening. We can illustrate this briefly with the form chirembe. So before the application of phrase final shortening, there was a sequence of 2 long vowels next to each other. If pre-long shortening had applied first, so remember this rule says that a vowel becomes short if the following vowel is long. If that had applied first, let's go back up, this would be the input, then the result would be that this long A would be shortened. And then subsequently, when phrase final shortening applies, then this A would apply. So in the order phrase final shortening followed by pre-long shortening, phrase final shortening is able to bleed pre-long shortening by removing the environment that is necessary for the application of pre-long shortening. So the basic principle with which we are operating here is simply that following from the utterance level, so syntactically seen, that would be a sentence node, or in other terms, a CP node, if you know what that means. um, whatever syntactic, whatever nodes are directly dominated by that, whatever syntactic phrases are directly dominated by that, will be transformed into phonological phrases. We saw in this case that we needed the application of phrase, we needed both rules that were phrase bounded and rules that were sensitive to the edges of phrases in order to generate the correct forms, where we have moarabu dete. Crucially, the most crucial part was the application of shortening of long vowels inside of phrases when they were followed by at least 3 other vowels. The result of that was to make sure that both vowels in the verb put on vete become short a. All right, so to close this section, we can, to close this section on boundaries, bounding domain, and bounding domains, we can think about why phonology should need or want to refer to boundaries whatsoever. Well, in one sense, maybe one practical aspect of boundaries is that they can have the effect of reducing or minimizing the amount of phonological alternations that apply. And this might make it easier for speakers sometimes to recognize words. So for instance, if we imagine that all phonological processes applied everywhere in running speech, that is, if all rules were like the process of R epenthesis in British English and only were blocked from applying by a long pause, then a lot more neutralizations would apply. So for instance, the processes of Canadian raising and tapping in North American English, if they were not word bounded, we would find a lot more taps and a lot more raised vowels that would create a lot more neutralizations. So these 2 phrases that we talked about, pry seals and price eels, as our example of Canadian raising, those would become phonetically identical if Canadian raising were not word bounded. So in this sense, these rules that are bounded by words or bounded by phrases create Grenzsignale. They create signals to, they give information about where the boundaries are between words or the boundaries are between syntactic phrases. And so if a rule happens to be blocked or triggered by a boundary, so we saw cases, we mentioned cases in Japanese of hiatus, vowel deletion, or in Polish, palatalization that needed to see the edge of a stem. A rule being blocked or triggered by a boundary helps the listener get other information that doesn't have any direct phonetic correspondent. So the word boundaries, the phrase boundaries for inside of words, the stem or root boundaries, those are not directly indicated by any sounds. So perhaps the application of processes that need to refer to those boundaries or are blocked by those boundaries help the speakers to say where the morphological boundaries are inside of words or where the boundaries between words or between syntactic phrases are. So in effect, these rules might help speakers in doing the work of morphological or syntactic parsing, saying, yes, I know a word is here. Yes, I know that this constitutes one syntactic phrase, for instance. So to summarize, we'll say that many, perhaps not all, but probably most phonological rules have some kind of bounding domain. Based on my experience, I would say that the most common bounding domain is probably the word domain here. Most rules that you will encounter and most rules that we have discussed in the course up to this point can be assumed to apply within the same word, but not outside of the same word. Work on so-called lexical phonology tends to examine the processes that are restricted to the smaller domains of the root and the stem, whereas sometimes finding data on words, on rules that are restricted by phrases and utterances tends to be a bit more tricky because it requires more fine phonetic data from longer utterances. But that doesn't change the fact that actually determining what the bounding domain of a rule is an important part of phonological analysis. So, and we've drawn this contrast between words, between rules that are restricted to a bounding domain versus rules that require a bounding domain in order to apply, like word final devoicing in German or Russian, hiatus deletion in Japanese, or palatalization in Polish. And in that case, the rules have to see the boundary, whether it's the left edge or the right edge of a boundary, and the rules can usually ignore lower, smaller boundaries than their domain. So for instance, in the Polish palatalization case, each of these stems, pas, servis, silos, those are also roots that were equivalent to stems. So they simply ignore the root and they see the stem boundary here, this right bracket, so to say, the right stem boundary preceding the inflectional affixes that begin with a vowel. So again, we can sum up and close by saying that probably the function of boundaries, the function of boundaries both in either blocking the application of rules or being necessary for saying a rule when it, telling a rule when it can apply, helps speakers to say what the morphological and syntactic structure of their utterances are. So in this sense, all of the parts of the grammar are working together. The phonology is helping give to speakers information about where structure is. And this might be particularly relevant in first language acquisition. That is, if babies or young children notice that there are certain phonological patterns, those phonological patterns might give further information in terms of what the syntactic or morphological structures are, which the language acquirer also needs to see. Okay, we'll close this section of the lecture here, and the following section will then come to the topic of phonological variation.